I want to see the president ensuring that within the agencies and departments, they're all guaranteeing equal protection for the unborn, thinking about the unborn as persons. I want to see states stepping up to the plate to protect the people within their jurisdictions. And I want to see the Supreme Court have a new holding that recognizes the unborn child as a person entitled to equal protection.
So we go way back with pro-life activism, and we're going to start there and then go into what we're doing today, what you're up to today. How did you first get involved in pro-life work?
Well, ever since I was a kid, my family had a passion for pro-life ministry and serving families and women in need. So everything from helping with crisis pregnancy centers to going out in front of the abortion clinic and protesting. I remember when I was young, probably like 8 or 10 years old, I went to the college campus at CU Boulder and debated college students on pro-life issues, trying to do advocacy and change minds there. So it's been a part of my life and, kind of ingrained through my family since I was young. And so I was, blessed to meet you. And I think high school, is maybe when we first met, and get to know your family as well, and come alongside Live Action to help their mission.
Well, we're very blessed to have you as a legislative strategist with us, and you doing a lot of other things. So just give everybody a quick introduction to who you are and what you're up to.
Sure. Well, I graduated from Harvard Law School several years ago. I clerked on the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, and now I do general commercial litigation and appeals, and I'm also an affiliated scholar with the James Wilson Institute. So wear many hats, but that's kind of how I do my work right now.
Awesome. And we're going to get into all things legislative strategy / what's going on with the Supreme Court and the future of pro-life in this country, what we do post-Dobbs. But before that, you said you got involved as a kid and you were passionate about life, and it sounds like your family was very pro-life. You're also very pro-life with the family you're having now. Tell me a little bit about your family. I'm a big fan of your wife.
Thanks.
And her Instagram account. So if you're listening, if you want to see great pro-life mom content, check out Caroline Craddock's Instagram. We'll link it.
Yeah. So my wife and I, Caroline and I, have 4 kids. Our oldest is 8 years old. We have a 6-year-old, a 2-year-old, and an 8-month-old. 2 boys, 2 girls. So.
And recently you went on a trip with them. Want to just talk briefly about that?
We did, yeah. We went to Australia and New Zealand, so we got to see all the wonderful wildlife in Australia, the kangaroos and the cassowaries, and then we did some hiking in New Zealand. And challenging, it definitely is challenging to travel with 4 little ones across the country, but it was so worth it, and just seeing them explore the world was so fun.
And it wasn't just 4 little ones, it was 4 little ones, and one of them was 2-month-old newborn.
Yeah, getting the passport in time after he was born within 8 weeks, but when we left was a challenge. But yeah, he did great on the flight. So
that is awesome. All right, so when you started pro-life work, and I think we knew each other through homeschool debate, so we were both homeschooled and doing NCFCA and all of that fun stuff. But it was also the early days of the personhood movement. I'm not the earliest days, but some of the earlier days of the personhood movement. So let's start there.
Yeah.
So you, fresh out of college, joined Personhood USA and started, I think, doing some very important groundbreaking work.
Well, back in 2008 and 2010, Colorado had several ballot initiatives where we said, hey, shouldn't every human being be considered a person under our Constitution, under our state Constitution? And so I worked on some of those ballot initiatives, and we were able to change minds. Each time the ballot initiative was brought forward on the Colorado ballot, it increased its percentage. And so we were literally changing hearts and minds through that political effort, and just teaching people that there's no distinction between human being and person. Every human being is a person. And so that's kind of how I got involved with that. When I went to college in New York, I started doing international advocacy for personhood at the UN. So, the UN is constantly passing resolutions that undermine life and the family. And so my job was to network with delegates from around the world, whether from Latin America or Africa, to really resist the UN and the US, unfortunately, at that time, our position internationally with respect to foreign aid or these resolutions that undermine life. And so again, doing personhood at the United Nations, and I was so excited to learn that so many countries actually recognize personhood. And so working with those countries that recognize personhood at the UN was a rewarding experience as well.
And so just to break this down for people who might not be familiar, personhood is a legal concept And the pro-abortion movement has basically said some humans aren't persons. So explain the pro-life response to that.
Yeah. Well, every time you have human beings who aren't considered legal persons, that's when human rights abuses happen. So you can think back to slavery, right? There was a famous Virginia Supreme Court case, actually, that said that the slave is not a person. And that was one of the reasons why they justified abusing African Americans in this country. And so in law, a person is pretty much interchangeable with human beings. So a natural person, every human being is a natural person. And so you can actually go back to Blackstone. He was one of the legal treatise writers. If you go back to the time of the founding, every lawyer would have had a copy of Blackstone on his shelf. And if you open up the Blackstone's commentaries, the first book is about the rights of persons. And if you can believe it, he actually begins his discussion of the rights of persons with a discussion of the unborn child's right to life and personal security. So in the American legal tradition, historically, every human being has been considered a person. And when that hasn't been true, that's when human rights abuses have taken place.
So when there were mistakes, severe mistakes made that permitted a slavery, and we actually had cases like the one you just referenced, which took away the humanity of the slave, saying they're not humans because they're not persons. How does that fit with the history of jurisprudence? Why were people not counting African Americans as persons?
Yeah, so there was a development where they said we're going to exclude this species of property, right? They said it's property, not persons. And that was how they got around that. And so a similar thing happened in Roe v. Wade, right? Justice Blackmun, the state of Texas actually argued in Roe that the unborn child is a person. And Justice Blackmun addressed that in his decision. He dismissed it saying, no, the fetus is not a person. It's not a full person, is what he said. But he admitted, he made an important concession when he said that if personhood was established, then the case for abortion would collapse and the fetus's right to life would then be guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. And so that triggered my mind. I was like, that's really interesting. And so that was actually the subject of my research when I was in law school. I wrote my law review note about that issue and why every unborn child is a person under the 14th Amendment.
Were you the first one to float that legal theory?
No, I wish, but it's actually been around for quite some time. So Texas, right, made the argument in Roe. Many of the amicus briefs in Roe made that argument. And if you go back since 1984, every Republican Party platform has actually endorsed the idea that the 14th Amendment's protections should be extended to the unborn. So Congress should legislate to ensure that the unborn are protected. President Reagan in 1988 actually issued a proclamation in which he said that the personhood of the unborn should be declared throughout the nation. So he even endorsed this 14th Amendment argument. So it's been around for quite a while.
Walk us through with Roe v. Wade, the legal argument and the response of Dobbs, what the justices argued in Dobbs that undermined ultimately Blackmun's theory. And where do we find the case for why the 14th Amendment should apply to the preborn child in Dobbs? Does it exist? Is it anywhere to be found?
Yeah, so that's a great question.
And just break it down for people because I think there's a lot of confusion. Like, well, the 14th Amendment, pro-lifers are saying preborn children are already protected. They're not being protected. And then the court, you mentioned Kavanaugh is already discounting that theory, saying 14th Amendment doesn't even matter. It doesn't apply to the preborn child. So walk us through the different steps there.
Yeah, so if you go back to what Roe held, it said that the 14th Amendment's guarantee of liberty included this right to privacy. The Due Process Clause has some sort of right to privacy, and that right to privacy includes abortion. And so the bottom line of Roe was that every state was required to allow abortion pretty much through all 9 months of pregnancy. Casey in 1992 kind of amended the Roe regime, and it said, got rid of some of the trimester framework, and it said, actually, the key question is viability. But at the end of the day, Casey was the same regime, right? Abortion through all 9 months, pretty much, and rooted in, again, the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. So Dobbs corrected Roe and Casey's holding that states are required to allow abortion. But they didn't go on to address the second problem in Roe, which was the holding that we talked about with Justice Blackmun, where he said the fetus is not a person. And so that they didn't address. And so there's...
Why not?
You might wonder, why didn't they address it? It seems obvious, right? Well, they're following a doctrine called party presentment. Usually, if the parties don't raise an argument, the court isn't going to address it. And also, they didn't need to address it to answer the precise question that was presented in Dobbs, which was whether states could pass restrictions on abortion before viability.
And why do you think the Mississippi Attorney General didn't address it?
I think they were just trying to go for the low-hanging fruit, so they didn't want to reach for everything. They just wanted to, take this kind of half approach. They were, they were asking for Roe and Casey to be overturned, but they didn't want to ask for personhood. So I think it was just a strategic decision that they made. But I don't think one thing I do want to draw out of the Dobbs opinion is that 5 times they distinguished other, what lawyers call substantive due process cases. It distinguished those other cases, and they said, no, abortion is different because it takes a human life. What the Mississippi statute calls an unborn human life. And so to make that distinction, they had to say there's something different about abortion. And I think that fundamental to the Dobbs holding then is this recognition that abortion is different because it takes a human life. And that naturally leads to the question, well, if it takes a human life, is that human being a person? And that's the question where we get to.
But why is that even a question? Because all human beings are persons.
Exactly.
So walk us through actually the wording of the 14th Amendment and what it says about persons.
Yeah, so there's a couple different parts of the 14th Amendment. As applicable to our question, the Due Process Clause and the Equal Protection Clause say any person, no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall any state deprive any person of the equal protection of the laws. So every person is entitled to due process and equal protection. Equal protection just means the same laws that protect you and me from violent acts, those laws apply to every person. You don't have to be a citizen, just any person.
But there's no definition of person.
That's right, yeah. A lot of people get tripped up because if you pull out a copy of the 14th Amendment, the first sentence says, all persons born or naturalized are citizens of the United States. And so they might get tripped up and they say, well, it says born right in the first sentence. How could you say that the unborn child is a person if it says born in the first sentence? But what they don't understand is if you're reading it carefully, it's just defining citizenship. It's saying this broad and undefined class of persons. You have to be either born or naturalized and subject to the jurisdiction of the United States to be a citizen of the United States.
But it applies to citizens and non-citizens.
Exactly. Well, so the Due Process and the Equal Protection Clause, they say any person, right? So the Privileges and Immunities Clause, that's just the privileges and immunities of citizenship. But then equal protection and due process, those apply to every person, regardless of whether you're a citizen or not.
So why hasn't our Constitution addressed or defined what it means to be a person?
Well, I think that...
it should be so obvious to people.
Well, there's a lot of things that aren't defined in the Constitution, and usually it's drawing on just the public meaning. What did people understand that to mean when the legislation or the amendment was adopted? They might be drawing on the common law, right? We talked about Blackstone earlier, for whom there was no distinction between like legal personhood and just biological humanity. So they're drawing on those concepts, and so they don't need to define it in the Constitution itself for those terms to have clear meaning.
There's a group of pro-life advocacy groups that want to have an amendment to the U.S. Constitution that declares what it means to be a person, so that these questions would be finally answered. I mean, a human life amendment, or there's different terms that they give it, or names that they give it. What do you think about that?
I think a human life amendment is a great idea, but it's really difficult to pass a new constitutional amendment. And so I would advocate for using the 14th Amendment, which we already have, that prohibits states from allowing abortion. And so I think that the 14th Amendment, it's sitting right there. Let's use it. And then, sure, we can, of course, work toward a human life amendment. That's fine. I'm not against that. But I think that's a lot more challenging.
But are you concerned? I mean, think about the future of like artificial intelligence and all of the different ways that it could go in terms of humanity being considered non-persons. The child in the womb obviously is the biggest victim of that today, but historically there have been others. Shouldn't there be, or maybe it's not a constitutional amendment, maybe it's a court ruling laying it out. If you are a unique individual, you're not even unique. If you're just an individual human, biological human, then you are a person, period.
Yeah.
Do you think the court should do that?
Absolutely, yeah. I think that if the case comes up where they have to decide, what the meaning of person is, that should absolutely be their ruling. Every human being is a legal person. And so there are other types of persons too in law, right? We have artificial persons like corporations, but natural personhood, every human being is a person, right? There might be other types of persons, but at least every type of human being is a person.
Have you thought about what would happen with transhumanism? What they might be considered, if that can even be accomplished, partially the DNA of in some kind of an animal, mostly a human DNA?
It's such a novel question. I'm not sure exactly how that would come out. It reminds me of in Jurassic Park. They say you're so focused on whether you could or not whether you should. Some of those, scientific experiments where they're, mixing human and animal genes and stuff like that, I think it's really degrading to the value of human persons. And that's one thing where ethics is so important in science and needs to be incorporated.
You've said a few times we can already use the 14th Amendment to defend children in the womb. We can already do this. How do we do it, though? The court clearly, under Dobbs, it was a step forward, obviously, overruling Roe, but it sent the question back to the states. And then you have so many states like California here, which is radically pro-abortion, and then our federal government today is radically pro-abortion. So there's nobody actually interpreting the 14th Amendment, practically speaking, and doing the legal protection that's necessary.
Well, I think the good news is that every level and branch of government has a role to play. So the states, pro-life states, already can pass pro-life laws securing equal protection for all the unborn human beings in their state, right? At the federal level, Congress has an enumerated power to enforce the 14th Amendment through legislation. So they could pass a national abortion ban. They have an enumerated power to do that in Congress. The president can use his power, a pro-life president can use his power to properly interpret the Constitution and ensure that the departments and the agencies that are all part of the executive branch, to make sure that they all are properly applying personhood to the unborn, right? So the Census Bureau, for example. Then the judiciary, right? If a case comes up before the judiciary, we've already talked about their obligation. And then in blue states, some states like mine, Colorado, California, where you live, I think a lot of pro-lifers need hope. They're like, where's the 14th Amendment? How's that going to help us here? I think in addition to those federal answers, there's also really encouraging movement at the local level to try and enforce 14th Amendment protections and federal law that prohibit abortion.
Talk to me about sanctuary cities.
Yeah.
For the unborn.
Yeah, sanctuary cities for the unborn. I love the concept because basically the idea is that a city or a county, for example, within a state that has radical pro-abortion laws can say, no, in our location, we're going to enforce federal law, which actually prohibits the interstate transport and use of abortion drugs and devices. Those localities can say, no, in our location, we're not going to allow these pro-abortion laws in our state to have force because the federal law trumps it. The federal law prohibiting that distribution and use of abortion drugs and devices, that trumps these pro-abortion state laws. And so they can actually pass ordinances to confer a private cause of action to allow people to sue abortionists and drug dealers that distribute these human pesticides.
Explain for everyone listening what a private cause of action is.
Yeah, good call. So basically, when you sue someone else, you have to have a cause of action. So it just means that a right to sue. Yeah, exactly. And so the ordinance could confer a right to sue on private parties, you and me. It wouldn't have to be a prosecutor or anything like that prosecuting criminal law. It can just be done civilly.
And explain what Texas's original law that went into effect to use private use of action against individuals to protect human lives, and also the backlash that they received. Lawmakers received.
Yeah, so one of the kind of novel uses of this private cause of action idea was in Texas, the SB 8 law you might be familiar with. So pretty much rather than using a criminal enforcement to prohibit abortion after detectable heartbeat, what they did is they said that any abortionist who performs an abortion after that detectable heartbeat can be sued. Anyone injured by that can sue the abortionist for, I think it was like $10,000. And just the threat of liability actually caused Planned Parenthood and the abortionists to shut down their abortion businesses after detectable heartbeat. So they weren't willing to risk it.
What states do you think have the best abortion abolition legislation? in effect right now?
I've seen some great legislation that's been introduced in a number of different states, and I think that the key is that it should protect every human being as a person, and it should invoke that 14th Amendment guarantee of equal protection. And so that abolition legislation can say, we want to secure equal protection for the unborn in our state.
Have you seen a state that's actually successfully passed legislation that you would consider a model?
I know
rest of the country?
Oklahoma has passed some really great legislation. There are other states as well that are similar. I think there's always ways we can do more and be better in each of these states, but I think Oklahoma is probably one of the states that's leading right now.
And walk us through what the Oklahoma law says.
Well, they have a Life at Conception Act that prohibits most abortions from conception. And so that's kind of where they're at right now.
Do they have exceptions?
I think they do. I think they do, but I don't recall exactly.
What's your take on exceptions?
Well,
exceptions for people listening are when lawmakers put into the law something like, oh, if the child's conceived in rape, or if there's a life-threatening emergency, then abortion's permitted.
I think these rape and incest exceptions, for example, are inconsistent with the principle that every human being is created by God, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, right? That's from our Declaration of Independence. And so saying that, if your father was a criminal, we punish, one of the victims, right? Both the woman and that child are both victims of a brutal assault. And so I think we should punish the rapist more harshly than we do, and we should protect the victims.
What's the worst state?
California and New York have got to be, although Colorado actually might be the worst. I'd say those are the three.
Yeah.
Have you seen some of the laws in Colorado recently?
No. Are there new ones that have passed?
They just passed another one. They banned the abortion pill reversal.
They did?
Yeah.
When did that happen, Josh?
They also, this was just a month ago, very recently. And they also have these new restrictions on the clinics or crisis pregnancy centers that help women. They've imposed restrictions on what they can say, how they can advertise. And we just had a Supreme Court case about this several years ago saying you can't compel speech for these crisis pregnancy centers who are helping women. And that's basically what they're doing, is they're prohibiting how they can advertise and how they can try and reach women.
That's insane. You helped us author the new North Star, which sets a new North Star for the pro-life movement. Before, everyone was talking about overturning Roe v. Wade and how important that was, and it happened. So what's next for the movement?
Yeah. For the past 50 years, we focused on overturning Roe v. Wade, and we accomplished that, which is such a huge answer to prayer and such a victory. But now we're wondering, what's the next step for the pro-life movement? And I think that this letter answers that question, saying that the answer is equal protection for the preborn. And so this is going to be a movement. It's going to be something we're going to work towards. That is our next goal as a pro-life movement, is to ensure equal protection across the United States.
There's a lot of discussion between pro-life groups and definitely in state legislatures right now, and debates about what is the right next step with pro-life legislation. And obviously, Live Action's position is complete legal protection. I know that's something you're advocating for too, and many others. But in some states, it's politically challenging to do. What's your take on the right legal philosophy when it comes to protecting children in states that are not, well, let's just say red states too, red states, blue states, and states where it's very hard to make any progress?
Yeah, well, I think it's really important for pro-lifers to continue to push their legislators, their lawmakers who ran on a platform of being pro-life, to be consistent in their pro-life ethic and in their legislation. And so I think pushing them to continue to ask for as much as you can. I think sometimes pro-lifers come to the table already bargaining against themselves. They say, okay, we'll let you, we'll say, okay, it's just a 20-week, thing. And maybe more is actually feasible. The other side doesn't come to the negotiating table already negotiating against themselves. They want abortion on demand through all 9 months, and they want taxpayers to fund it, and they don't want anyone to criticize them for it. They're not negotiating with anyone before they get to the lawmakers. And so I don't think we should do that either. So if we want more protective laws in our states, we shouldn't negotiate against ourselves before we start talking to lawmakers.
I think it's so true. Candidates in elections, and then obviously actual legislators, seem so scared that their opponents are going to paint them with a broad brush as being anti-woman and just out of their minds if they do a pro-life law, make a pro-life law. But the reality is, it doesn't matter the kind of pro-life law you make, they're going to attack you either way.
Totally.
So you might as well pass a pro-life law that actually protects all the children instead of one that protects some, because you're going to get blowback either way.
Totally. Yep. Exactly.
And there's some courage in some states and some good things happening, but I was encouraged to see Governor DeSantis actually pass the heartbeat law.
Yeah.
Because I was talking with folks, 6+ months ago, insiders saying, oh, there's no way he's going to do that because it's too politically complicated. And then he did it. And I thought he didn't have to do it. He had a 15-week abortion law. And I think in a general election, if he chooses to run, pro-lifers against a pro-abortion candidate are going to be like, okay, he's better than the pro-abortion candidate. But I think it definitely showed that he cared.
Absolutely. And you know what? They would have painted him as a pro-life extremist anyway, regardless of what he had done. And so he did the right thing by signing that legislation, not cowing to political pressure.
Walk us through what's happening with the abortion pill right now, because it's been in the news a lot. The court has been, my understanding is it's at the Fifth Circuit right now and it's in appeals. But during COVID, the FDA's regulations requiring an in-person visit to take the abortion pill was removed. So people could literally have the abortion pill sent to them via mail.
Yep.
But walk us through the history of that, what happened in Texas with the Texas judge and his decision, and then why it's at the Fifth Circuit now.
Yeah, so this abortion pill was originally approved by the FDA back in 2000. And then more recently were the changes under the Biden administration that you were just discussing about how, they're expanding access to this abortion pill so that pretty much anyone, right, can get it without even a medical professional, which is completely dangerous for women, not to mention the unborn children that are killed through this pill. So the litigation going on in Texas right now, there was a district court opinion that basically gave a preliminary injunction against that rule, the FDA's rule.
And just explain just briefly, what is a preliminary injunction?
Yeah, so basically the judge said you can't apply this rule temporarily because we think that the people who are suing have a good point and they might win at trial. And so we're going to stop this rule from going into effect any longer. That went up on appeal ultimately to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court reversed that, got rid of the stay. And so now the FDA's rule is back in effect, but it's pending the outcome of this litigation.
Was that really disappointing to you in the Supreme Court not even hearing the abortion pill case?
Yeah, I think there were lots of reasons that they could have kept the stay in place. I'll be interested to see how the Fifth Circuit approaches the issue. I just saw the panel that they drew, the judges that are going to be deciding the case on the merits. And I think those judges are very smart, and so I think that they're going to have a good analysis of this.
Can you describe what that means when they're hearing the case on the merits, and then also explain what it means to poll judges? Because there's a lot of judges on the Fifth Circuit, but only a few have to actually hear the case.
Yeah, so the merits would be different from, for example, what we were just talking about, the preliminary injunction, which is like at the beginning of the case. Do we want to try and stop this rule from going into effect because it might cause irreparable harm, or and we think that the people who are suing have a good case on the merits.
So it's kind of like being out on bail before serving your time because it hasn't been decided you should serve your time.
Yeah, you could make that analogy. Yeah, and then on the merits is really the meat of what the plaintiffs are suing about, what they're suing about. Whether the rule is actually the procedure was not followed correctly, or the substance of the rule is wrong.
And the Texas judge ruled that it was wrongly, the FDA's approval process was wrongly done and it was illegal, but then that was appealed, right? And then that went to the Fifth Circuit.
Yeah, he ruled that it was likely that the plaintiffs would be able to prove that it was unlawfully promulgated.
Okay, so he didn't actually decide. He didn't actually decide that, though.
Yeah, he didn't decide the merits.
Okay.
He was just addressing the preliminary injunction.
Got it. So what do you think is going to happen at the Fifth Circuit?
I don't know. We'll see. I think that the threshold procedural questions are really thorny, but I think the plaintiffs have a good case on the merits.
Okay. So if they do say it is illegal how this was fast-tracked, how the abortion pill was fast-tracked, does that mean the abortion pill gets pulled from the market? What happens next?
I think it depends on how they rule it. They might just address the most recent COVID regulations, or they might go all the way back to that initial approval in 2000. So it really depends. If they go all the way back to 2000, then yeah, this product would not be approved. The abortion pill would not.
So could it get reintroduced for approval?
I don't know that.
Because they're not deciding that the product is not fit for the market,
Right.
just that the approval process was, because it was fast-tracked under Bill Clinton,
I think
they're
that's
saying
right.
the way that it was done was illegal.
I think that's right.
Okay. So best case scenario, what? They say this was done illegally, and then it would get appealed, and then would it go to the Supreme Court?
It could end up back at the Supreme Court.
Maybe they would rule best case scenario. It was approved illegally.
Unlawfully done, yeah.
And then unlawfully done. And then it goes back to the FDA to lawfully approve it, and they
I think that's right. I think that's right.
And all that time, the abortion pill will still be on the market?
It would be on the market for, so because they don't have it stayed right now, it depends on how the Fifth Circuit does it, but I think that it would stay on the market until that's
So what good has this entire exercise done?
Well, I think it's one thing that's been helpful.
Playing devil's advocate.
Yeah, one thing that's been helpful is, well, first, they still might prevail, right? They still might actually get this thing off the market at some point. But secondly, I think it's taught people about the danger of the abortion pill. And finally, it's also reinvigorated a federal law that's been on the books for about 150 years, 18 USC 1461 and 1462. And those are the federal laws that prohibit the interstate transport and sale and use of abortion drugs and devices. And so I think that is going to be a really crucial question as we move forward on the abortion pill litigation.
So how is it legal for any abortionist today to order abortion devices?
It's just because the Biden administration has said that if the abortion pill is not unlawful in the state, then it's not against federal law.
Right, but I mean, even before the Biden, let's say under the Obama administration or any administration, if there is a federal law that says you can't actually take any kind of abortion device, not even a pill, but device across state lines, that's necessarily done if an abortionist is ordering new equipment.
Well, it's because we were living under the Roe regime until last year, right? So under Roe...
So Roe trumped that federal law.
Exactly, yeah. Roe said, well, abortion's a constitutional right, so you wouldn't apply that federal law
So
at all.
Separate from the abortion pill, is there another case waiting to happen to just challenge any interstate abortion?
Yeah, so some of the sanctuary city laws that we were talking about earlier, there's litigation going on in New Mexico right now raising this federal question of under that federal law. So there's several cases that are pending. I think this is going to be a huge area of litigation over the next year or two.
Do you know the history of why that law was passed 150 years ago?
Yeah, so it was passed, it addressed lots of issues, not just abortion, but basically it was designed to help promote public morals, essentially. And so it addressed a lot of things. It addressed pornography, it addressed abortion. So it's a pretty broad law, and it had many purposes, but at that time it was trying to promote virtuous living.
But it didn't ban abortion.
It didn't, yeah. So the federal
most
government...
abortion was banned at that time.
That's right, yeah. So the states already prohibited abortion, and so the federal government's role was just making sure that things weren't being transported through the mails.
That's an important point, because it is typically the state's job to create and enforce homicide laws.
Exactly.
So abortion was typically outlawed that way, and the federal government wanted to kind of play a role in protecting public morality, you could say, or just human rights. And so they said, okay, you can't also, if you get caught with trafficking drugs or devices, and there's additional penalties.
Exactly. Yep.
Do you think that do you think that the future of the movement is a federal law banning abortion? Or do you think that it's not that it should be left up to the states, because the states have a responsibility to ban abortion, but that it would be sufficient for states, provided they do? I mean, that's the question, right? But theoretically, states could have, just like they have their own homicide laws, their own anti-abortion laws under their homicide laws, and the federal government doesn't even get involved. Yeah,
I mean, if every state had a law prohibiting abortion and had that incorporated in their homicide laws, I don't think there would be a need for federal legislation. Unfortunately, the reality is that a lot of states aren't going to do that. And so that's where federal legislation steps in and says, no, the state can't discriminate against unborn children by withholding the protection of these homicide laws.
Or somebody would sue on behalf of the unborn child in California who's not being protected. I mean, how would that even work?
Yeah, so that actually happened before Roe. There was a lot of times, if there's a child who can't represent him or herself, and the parent, their interests are adverse to the child, they would actually have what's called a guardian ad litem. So that's someone else who comes in to represent the interests of the child. This actually happened for unborn children, going back at common law, in property disputes, right? So you might have a child whose interests in an inheritance are adverse to those of the child's parents. And so you'd have a guardian ad litem step in to represent those interests. And you could do the same thing, in cases to vindicate the rights of the unborn.
But isn't the guardian ad litem usually assigned by the state?
It can be. They're not necessarily. So the one famous example prior to Roe in New York, it wasn't assigned by the state. It was just someone who volunteered to do it as a Fordham Law professor.
So how would that work in California?
So it's complicated.
Okay. Would it work in California?
It could, yeah. I think it would work in California. It's complicated, the procedural technicalities of how it would work, but because any person is entitled to due process, that means that an unborn child, if her interests are at stake in a court case, she has a right to due process, and that includes legal representation.
Right, but I'm thinking about a case where the parent is considering abortion or planning abortion for that child. How would you even start a court case?
So someone could
on that child's behalf.
Yeah, someone could sue it, claiming the guardian ad litem status, saying that the court needs to step in to prevent this from happening. Typically, it would be directed also addressing, if you're bringing in the constitutional question, you'd be addressing the state law as well.
And then probably the California judge would just throw that out.
that might happen. Yeah, and then you go through the normal
Should pro-lifers try that?
I think it's a great idea. I think that they did it in New York prior to Roe. And I think we could reinvigorate that idea now.
Is your position with legal strategy, we just have to try everything we can?
I do think that,
or most things that we can.
I do think it's a both and strategy in a lot of cases, whether it's the states and the federal government, Congress and the president, the local sanctuary cities for the unborn, and the judiciary. So I think that all of these approaches need to be taken, and I don't think there's a one size, we need to be firing on all cylinders.
There's a lot of flack that the pro-life movement gets about penalties for women, saying, oh, you just want women to go to jail. And nobody just wants women to go to jail. We want justice and we want to protect preborn children. What do you think is the right response to who gets penalized for abortion once abortion's illegal?
Well, first, I think equal protection is separate from penalties, right? So in our current system, each state decides how they deal with homicide, right? In our normal homicide laws, states have different gradations of homicide. They decide how to punish it. They decide who to punish based on culpability. And so I think that adopting that equal protection argument doesn't mean that every state has to have the same approach to how to deal with punishing the crime of abortion.
So you're saying different states have different homicide laws and deal with it differently, and so let the states figure that out.
Yeah.
It's not let the states decide whether or not to protect children in the womb.
Exactly.
It's just let the states decide how that criminal penalties are given.
Yeah, and if you look back historically, at the time when all the states did prohibit abortion, some of them just punished abortion as they did with other forms of homicide. They didn't exclude, any particular, group of people from being the subject of those laws. Other states actually had either by legislation or a procedure for granting immunity to women who obtained abortions, because the woman is the most likely person to be able to testify against the abortionist, right? And so they had built into their either legislative or prosecutorial structures this granting of an immunity to the woman to testify against the abortionist, so that they could prioritize the prosecution of basically these serial killers who are going around committing abortion.
Did you think 10 years ago, when you were first getting heavily involved, maybe it was a little more than that, did you think that we would be where we are with Roe being overruled?
I honestly probably wouldn't have believed it. And so I'm so thankful. Like when they actually took the Dobbs case, I got a little bit more hopeful. But then you think back to Casey, when everyone thought that Roe v. Wade was going to be overturned, and then they reaffirmed Roe. It's hard to get your hopes up. And so I'm just so thankful that the court did the right thing in the face of enormous pressure, right? There was an actual assassination attempt against a sitting Supreme Court justice to try and prevent Dobbs from being decided. And so I'm thankful that in the face of that enormous pressure, they did the right thing.
And it's crazy that in just the 6 months since Dobbs, 32,000 children were born that otherwise are estimated would have been killed.
Absolutely.
Because of trigger laws going into effect.
Yeah.
What do you think is going to happen in 10 years?
I would love to see in 10 years equal protection. That is our new North
By what
Stars.
mechanism?
Yeah, all of them, all of them, Lila. I want to see a congressional law to ensure equal protection. I want to see the president ensuring that within the agencies and departments, they're all guaranteeing equal protection for the unborn, thinking about the unborn as persons. I want to see states stepping up to the plate to protect the people within their jurisdictions. So I would love to see all those things. And I want to see the Supreme Court have a new holding that recognizes the unborn child as a person entitled to equal protection.
I think we're going to see it. And what happens to California and our Colorado and New York?
I think the same thing that happened, after Brown v. Board was decided. There's going to be resistance, right? But it was the right thing to do. Brown v. Board was the decision that desegregated schools and overturned the separate but equal doctrine, right? Where the Supreme Court had made this mistake in the late 1800s. They said separate but equal is okay. And so there was massive resistance to the Brown decision that desegregated the schools. But ultimately, states had to comply, and the federal government stepped up to enforce that decision.
And what do you think you'll be doing in 10 years, Josh?
I hope that I won't have to be fighting for equal protection anymore, but I'm looking forward to spending time with my kids and continuing to do law.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sitting down and talking.
Thanks for having me.